Hello, Division 32 people. If we haven't met, my name is Micah Ingle. Hopefully we'll get to see each other in person before too long, when it's safe to do so. So welcome to my talk, Common Landscapes, a Qualitative Inquiry into the Liberatory Potential of Group Work. This talk is essentially based on the dissertation work that I'm currently doing. I'm in my, fingers crossed, last year of my PhD program here at the University of West Georgia. And this is my dissertation project. It's in process right now, so forgive me if things are a little bit messy in some ways, but it's happening. Slowly but surely it's happening, and I wanted to present what I have thus far. So I did do a presentation over the summer for the main APA convention conference, the Division 32 Hospitality Suite, I think it was. I did present on some of this material there, so I apologize if you watched that and there's some crossover between the two. But there is new stuff here too. So if you did watch that, don't think that it's going to be exactly the same. Okay, so I think to start off, just explaining, kind of situating my project a little bit, both at a personal level and at a sort of general social level. I think I'd like to read from the introduction that I have so far. It's a second draft, so I'm still working on it. And I'm usually not a big fan of reading papers at conferences, but I think this is a good way to introduce what I'm doing. So I start off with a quote from Michel Foucault, the French philosopher. He says, "Search for what is good and strong and beautiful in your society and elaborate from there. Push outward. Always create from what you already have. Then you will know what to do." So I like that. And then I move into an experiential vignette because, sort of displaying my humanistic roots here, I have a strong affinity for experiential-based things, in addition to sort of valuing intellectual work and labor. So I wanted to start off with an experiential vignette. So, the chairs were arranged in a circle, a common practice in process groups. It had been a long weekend of similar groups, and I was feeling drained. Inadequate sleep and strained relations with friends and others over the weekend left me feeling queasy and unstable. I don't remember how it started. I remember coming into the group feeling that sense of unease in my body, uncertain about the people sitting next to and across from me. I remember feeling self-protective, guarded, a little ashamed at the sorry state that I was in. On some level, I hoped that the other people in the group wouldn't see me. The other members ranged in age and gender. There were older men, older women, and people closer to my own age of, at the time, around 29. I'm 32 now. I knew a couple people from past groups, didn't know others. Again, I don't remember how it started. I just remember an older man's verbal reflections, speaking to and about the group. He was talking about the notion of legacy and death. For some of the older people in the room, mortality had taken on a greater salience. He voiced a metaphor. Ocean waves lapping against a coast, facilitating minute but significant changes in the sand and shore through each retreat and return. He hoped that his work and presence throughout his life as a therapist, including his presence in this group and groups like it, had had this effect. To me, it was a powerful image, and I felt it in my settling gut. I felt a sense of relief, both in empathically identifying with his hope and in gratitude for people, elders, who cared, who found purpose in guiding. I both thirsted after guidance and wanted to someday take up a similar role. Perhaps what I liked most about the image was its evocation of process. These waves, this shore, not atomized individuals, trapped up within their own heads or bodies or symptoms or discrete lives. Contained in the image, for me, was a deep recognition of our mutual interdependence and embeddedness, our ongoing, never-ending, co-reconstituting activities with others. One grain of sand at a time, one experience, however minute, perhaps, but in slow flux nonetheless. I felt more connected hearing this metaphor. I felt more connected to this man, to others in the group, even to myself as linked, as interconnected. No longer quite so caught up in my own dramas, my own symptoms, my own anxieties, my own insecurities. I suspected from the shifting body language and my sense of the affect circulating the room that others were also inspired to enter a different space, a different practice of self and other relationship. I was, perhaps for the first time, able to talk about some of my recent forays into being an educator. I think a year or two when this was happening. I knew that there was room to grow, but in this group I was able to recognize what I was doing well, which has traditionally been difficult for me. When I did so, when I recognized what I was doing well as an educator, other group members were congratulatory, even celebratory. It's hard to convey the sense of affirmation and supportive collective feeling that emerges in such instances and the rippling effects that can result. I hope this dissertation project can manage, if nothing else, to paint a broader and more intricate picture of these kinds of experiences, as well as their potential effects, not only for the individuals involved, a program of individual adaptation, but for larger communities and a world in need. Okay. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here, not read the entire introduction. But that was the vignette. So I'll start here. So I can't help but see and experience certain features of what Walsh, Teo, and Baydala, this is Thomas Teo, if you're familiar with his work, critical psychologist, term European and Anglo-American cultures. So I can't help but see and experience certain features of what these cultures, or certain features of these cultures as problematic. Problematic. What is problematic? Many Europeans and Anglo-Americans are quite alienated from one another. The latter is my primary focus as an Anglo-American myself, writing from within an Anglo-American context, although I don't want to discount the experience of people of color and other minorities on this issue, but I am going to be focusing largely on Anglo-Americans just because that's my lived experience and what I know best. But I am going to consider other populations. So, we live in silos, not of our own invention. Historical factors will be explored, but certainly of our own ideological and material maintenance. We are kept apart from each other. This can take the literal form of discrete, sometimes gated neighborhoods, individual housing and individual rooms within, individual automobiles, individual engagement with technology, individual, it's a lot of individual work cubicles, some tendencies of neoliberal decentralization, like with tech startups, exploring sort of more communal organizational forms notwithstanding, individual career assessment, individual grades in the education system. Psychotherapists. And I am trained as a psychotherapist, so I don't intend this as a slight, but I think there is something to be addressed here. Psychotherapists chatter ad infinitum about the importance of personal and interpersonal boundaries, while also recognizing the need for relationship. Relationships constituted by healthy, independent individuals, capable of relating, but certainly not fusing or becoming codependent. This is, of course, reflected across various dimensions of our social and political existence. Individual rights, individual private property, individual needs, individual psychopathology. Our political process is individual in many ways, with ballot booths emphasizing the privacy of the individual vote. Now, this isn't in the introduction here, but even the way that we understand our leaders and the political system itself is sort of everything is about Trump, everything is about Biden. Even that is a kind of individualism. We value a healthy narcissism, striving, grinding, hustling for one's own. No one else can complete you. If people don't contribute to the betterment of your station in life, excise them. If people get in your way, it may be healthy to feel remorse, but you should nonetheless compete in a mad scramble to the top. I will argue, ultimately, that in Western and Anglo-American cultures, we are experiencing, or perhaps it experiences us, a mode of hermeneutic subjectivity defined by increasingly atomized individualism. So there's a manifold of consequences of this emphasis on the individual for Anglo-Americans. For my purposes, I will focus on two. The first is related to emotional, relational, and existential well-being. We know that loneliness is on the rise in the US, and we know that there is an abundance of detrimental effects that follow. We know that people are hungry for connection amid declining community bonds, and that things like drug addiction are likely to intersect with feelings of isolation. We know that people are suffering from a variety of mental health conditions at catastrophic rates, providing new market demographics for pharmaceutical and psychotherapeutic solutions, which of course focus on the rehabilitation of the individual. The second thing that I want to focus on is political. So feminists once stated that the personal is political. Now it has been suggested, I can't remember who said it, the political is personal. This manifests in a variety of ways, from a focus on neoliberal identity-based politics, what some have called politics of recognition, again creating new market demographics for consumption of goods, to the alluded to reduction of political action to the ballot booth. What are your political opinions, your stated allegiances? What is interior to you politically? How do you feel, think, dress, or behave to communicate that interiority? Who did you vote for? Are you eco-friendly in your habits of individual consumption? This personalization of the political has powerful effects on the possibility, even the conceived possibility, of collective political action. So now I will turn to a discussion of the purpose and aim of this dissertation after that sort of polemical rant, which I really just had to throw in there. Specifically how I frame the problem of Western individualism that I've been alluding to, as well as some possible solutions, and how my research addresses and expands on these questions. Okay, so I'm not going to read too much more here, but I do want to read a little bit more. So, again, Michel Foucault famously stated in an interview that my job is making windows where there were once walls. In a similar vein, the left-wing cultural critic Mark Fisher states, as any number of radical theorists, from Brecht, if I'm saying his name right, through to Foucault and Badiou, have maintained, emancipatory politics must always destroy the appearance of a natural order, must reveal what is presented as necessary and inevitable to be a mere contingency, just as it must make what was previously deemed to be impossible seem attainable. It is my contention, from a perspective at once political and psychological, that one of the primary walls or inevitabilities, which must be understood as contingent for psychologists invested in social change, is the state of the atomized Western person. So, cultural psychologists have long talked about the finding that, although complicated by heterogeneous subcultures and situational factors, Western cultures tend to be defined by an independent mode of self-construal, as opposed to an interdependent mode. These modes are commonly referred to as individualism and collectivism. So Baumeister, who does some really good work here, describes the modern Western fascination with the independent self, as well as an emphasis on increasingly granular self-definition, as an essentially historical construction. I'm not going to go into his sort of timeline of that, but he traces it throughout history. An important thing to note here is, of course, that a culture of individualism does not mean that people are factually or ontologically separate from each other. As Courtois notes, individualism or individualization in Western cultures is a cultural value system central to the construction of the notion of the self, rather than a description of the material or ontological nature of things, as individuals are always interdependent in their reliance on shared, networked, social, political, agricultural, economic, technological, and geographic facets of human societies. Now, perhaps more than ever, we have this paradox of the increasing construction of individualization with increasing globalization, or the extensivity of the global coinciding with the intensivity of the individual, which comes from those terms come from the German sociologists Beck and Beck-Gernsheim. So, this project is an attempt to analyze contemporary Western individualism, as well as to explore alternative community-oriented practices or techniques of subjectification, following Foucault. It is important to state several things at the outset. First, this project is philosophical, and more specifically epistemological in nature. So contrary to the widespread version of scientific psychology, which situates itself historically as evolving out of naturalistic 19th century physical sciences, getting this from Danziger, here I'm concerned with psychology as a hermeneutic endeavor. So I talk a little bit more about hermeneutics here, but I'm not going to go into that. Suffice it to say that I am interested in sort of my theoretical framework I'm interested in using hermeneutic thinkers such as Gadamer, Charles Taylor, Nicholas Smith, who does some really good work, and of course Foucault. Foucault is sort of at the center of a lot of this for me, although his classification as a hermeneutic thinker is complicated. As Dreyfus and Ravenel say, Foucault was beyond hermeneutics, although sensitive to its attractions. So, okay. So, like Foucault, I view subjectivity as hermeneutically constructed along certain historical, epistemological, and socio-political, or what he calls biopolitical, vectors of development. Our experiential horizons, perhaps even the structure of our psyches and our worlded relations more fully, are beholden, to some degree or other, to the times and places in which we live. It is from these grounds that we think, act, and relate. Inherent in this perspective, this again sort of recalls the thing about making windows where there were once walls. Inherent in this perspective is the belief that our subjectivities and our forms of life can be otherwise. Okay, so I think that's enough of an introduction. Hope that wasn't too grueling. Okay, so I'm not going to talk much about these slides. This is really just talking a little bit about what I've already touched on. I will be using critical psychology as a framework. I will be using liberation psychology as a framework. And I'm sort of including hermeneutic thinking as a type of critical psychology, which is debatable, but that's how I'm approaching it. So as I mentioned, I'm really interested in proposed solutions to this increasing isolation, this increasing individualization that we're facing in this culture, which I think is connected to a lot of really destructive political forces, and social and psychological. So I'm really interested particularly in group work and practices aimed, as you can see here, at promoting community, interconnectedness, and what the liberation psychologist Mary Watkins calls the commons, specifically, in my thinking, sort of the psychological commons. Okay. So just a quick note, when I say group work here, and I'll say more about this, but I'm essentially, the construct is broad, right? So by group work, I'm thinking more conventional forms of group therapy and group psychoanalysis, as well as sort of more contemporary approaches to group work that we'll talk about. So it's kind of a broad construct, and I'll have to justify that, but I think there's a justification for it. I'm also interested, so I'm not just interested in sort of ameliorating isolation and helping people feel less alone. I mean, that's, I think as a psychologist, I personally find that meaningful and important, but that's not my only focus here. So I have a secondary focus in this dissertation, which is political. So I'm particularly interested in how group work can support and be adjunctive to initiatives in social justice. Again, broadly construed. So my participants have a variety of different interests. They're all, well, I'll save this for when I get there. But yeah, just to say that there is a political element to this. There's a psychological element and a political element. And a lot of this is inspired by institutional psychotherapy, which is a form of therapeutic practice in France and some other places in the 50s, 60s, 70s, something like that, People like Frantz Fanon were involved in it. People like Felix Guattari were involved in it. And I think it's really interesting and important work. I won't say much about it now. I will just say that the goal of institutional psychotherapy was to try to wed the psychic and the social. Try to really see those two things as inseparable. And so not treat people individualistically, but treat people as a sort of community, where the goal of the treatment is not just individual rehabilitation, individual adaptation, but actually the creation of a community. And specifically because, Fanon, and if anybody knows these guys, Fanon was a Marxist. Guattari was also a Marxist, communist. So they had, creation of a community as a goal, and also sort of a community of action, a community that has an action element to it. So that's a big inspiration for my work. Okay, so this is some of the lit review stuff. I haven't done all this yet. I mean, I've been, learning this stuff for years, but I haven't written the literature review yet. But basically, I'm going to try to trace the development of individualism through the history of the West. I'm going to use Foucault for this. I'm going to use some other people like Charles Taylor. Again, this sort of historical hermeneutic perspective that sees subjectivity as something contingent to historical, social, political dimensions, rather than something that's just natural or just biological, right? So there's it's sort of a social constructionist type of thing, but it's hermeneutic. All right, so I'm trying to trace the development of individualism just to understand it better and to get a sense of where we are and why we are here. Right? Foucault talked about his work as a history of the present, which is what I'm interested in. So I'll talk about that. I'll talk about neoliberalism, because I really don't have time to go into neoliberalism right now, but I think it is a strong danger to any social justice movement. And if you want to know more about that or talk to me about that, just shoot me an email or message me on Facebook if we're friends or something like that, and I'm happy to talk about it. Don't have time here, but I do want to talk about neoliberalism. I also want to talk about some liberation psychology stuff. So Mary Watkins has this idea that she calls accompaniment. And for her, accompaniment is essentially how you get to the psychological commons. And it's basically, one way she describes accompaniment is breaking bread with others. So it's a sort of radical communitarian ethos in a way. And I think that through that activity, you can start to develop more of a sense of sort of community, more of a sense of collectivity away from this individualistic focus that we have. There's also a concept from Bell Hooks, rest in peace, which she calls home places. And in her work, a home place is somewhere, and this was, particularly she was writing about and for black women. So I want to be careful about how I sort of use this idea. But essentially a home place for her was a place where black women could go and sort of, congregate together, support each other, nourish each other. It was a place of rejuvenation. It was a place where they would discuss a lot of the discrimination and oppression that they experienced in their lives. And it was also a place for strategy, for strategizing, politically, essentially, how to do things differently, how to move the needle, how to change the world in whatever ways that they had available to them. So this notion of the home place is informative for me. Okay, I talked about institutional psychotherapy. Some other stuff I'm going to be including, there is plenty of quantitative and qualitative literature on group work, group therapy. The problem that I have and why I'm doing this dissertation and the sort of gap that I think it fills is that the majority of work the majority of the literature on group therapy is again about the individual. So it's, does this person who goes into the group therapy setting, do they come out better? Right? Do they have good individual outcomes? And that can have its place, but that's not what I'm primarily concerned with. I'm concerned with the creation of solidarity and community rather than just individual adaptation, symptom reduction, that kind of thing. Okay, and then I'm also going to have some stuff from Robert Putnam, who's talked about the sort of decline of community in the United States, as well as there's some really interesting German sociology that I mentioned earlier on individualization and liquid modernity is what they talk about, so that's going to be included. Okay, so the purpose of this, the whole reason for this, it took a while to get here, but we're here. And some water. So I'm really looking to gain a richer understanding and appreciation of the healing power of community-oriented therapeutic and support practices. Right, so that's kind of the first thing that I've talked about, with a second eye toward methods of cultivating common landscapes from which people can work together for broader social and political change. So the term common landscapes, which is in the title of the dissertation, actually comes from a support group that I was involved in, which I won't go into now, but I will talk about it in my dissertation. It was a very meaningful experience for me, and so that's the title of my work. So, to get at this question, to understand these practices better, to understand how, if they can support political work, I decided to conduct qualitative research. So I've interviewed 5 individuals who are politically engaged, so they have some kind of interest in political work, whether that's anti-racism or destigmatization around mental health issues or other things. So my participants are, and I'm getting ahead of myself here because I have a slide for this, but my participants are people who are politically engaged in this way, have some sort of political interest, and have experience in some sort of group setting. Right? So that, again, that could be group therapy, it could be mental health support groups, etc. So those are the requirements that they have experienced, that they meet these 2 criteria. Yeah, so the criteria being experiences in these groups related to the creation of a shared sense of community, and their understanding of how this collective group work may or may not influence their understanding and or practice of political engagement. So can group work have a positive impact on political work, essentially? Okay, so for my participants, I put out a call for interviews on the Mad in America website, which is a website that I write for, and there's probably a couple other people in Division 32 who write for Mad in America, which focuses on, sort of critical psychiatric, psychological perspectives. So I put my call for interviews out on there. I got 5 people. In terms of demographics, 3 are men, 1 is a woman, 1 identified as they and she. Racially, 4 of them were Caucasian, 1 was Latinx. Age, all the participants are between 30 and 40. And just an example of the type of groups, I'm trying to be sensitive about sharing too much information about the groups themselves, but I can say, like it's the type of groups like mutual aid support groups, which are essentially based in anarchist principles around, mutually aiding each other. That's pretty much what it sounds like, rather than sort of relying on outside experts, expertise, the state, stuff like that. Groups like the Hearing Voices Network, which, if you're not familiar, is a really interesting group that does sort of destigmatizing work around psychosis as well as other symptoms. So for the procedure, I did semi-structured interviewing. My questions were drawn partly from my personal experience, because I've been involved in a lot of group work, as well as questions drawn from the psychological sense of community scale. So I wanted to take a look at the scale and then see sort of how I could try to sort of measure, get at, qualify sense of community. So some of them were drawn from that. So here are my interview questions. I am not going to go into a lot of detail here because I want to save time for some of my preliminary findings, which is the new thing if you watched the one over the summer. So I've done all my data collection and I'm in the analysis stage. But so essentially I'm trying to get at, there's sort of two phases to my questions. I'm trying to get at some experience that people have had in a group that's been meaningful to them, that's involved a sense of community, including some sort of group dynamic issues like conflict, as well as sort of caring, tenderness, because I think these sort of sub-issues are important to understand how groups function, which is a part of what I'm interested in. And then the second phase is essentially relating to the political issue of, has this group work affected how you understand yourself, how you understand your political work, how you go about your political work, that kind of thing. So those are the final questions. Okay, so for the method of analysis, I chose something pretty simple here. I chose thematic analysis. I didn't want to do something too complex like IPA, phenomenological analysis. I wanted something that would give me sort of a lot of flexibility, because a lot of the sort of meat, sorry if you're a vegetarian, a lot of the meat of my dissertation is going to be what I find from the interviews, and then I really want to put that data into dialogue with some of the theory that I'm coming in with, right? So I'm using thematic analysis. I'm using Braun and Clark's guideline for how to do thematic analysis. And I do want to say here that when it comes to collecting the data, I am trying very, very hard to be inductive about it. I'm trying very, very hard to come from the ground up. So, I have all this theory and all my own personal experiences and everything floating in the back of my head. I'm trying to bracket a lot of that during the data analysis phase. Of course, once I've done data analysis, then all that's going to come flooding back in, and really I would like to stage a dialogue between the themes that I find and some of my theoretical interests, some of what I've already talked about. And I'm curious to see what that dialogue will produce. Okay, so on to the preliminary findings. So again, these are preliminary. This is a work in progress. I've started analyzing the data. I've looked at it. I've started sort of collecting emerging codes. I wouldn't say that I have themes at this point. I'm more just at the coding phase. But I have found already some sort of commonalities between the people's experiences that I've interviewed. So the first one is this sense of moving from isolation to community, and even shared stories, which comes from one of my participants. So just a side note real quick, any identifying information like cities, or ethnicities, specific ethnicities, stuff like that, I've changed it. So it's been anonymized. So Jay says, in relation to her experience in a sort of mutual aid, peer support type group, peer-oriented, peer-led support group. She says, just giving people a community to participate in, to feel like they're not completely alone in the world, and that somebody is looking out for them. Okay. L says, even from the emails, so this was a support group. It's a bit of a complicated backstory. This was a support group for people living in the U.S. who are from another country, and their country was experiencing a natural disaster. And so L was involved in a support group for people from his culture, sort of trying to navigate and deal with a lot of the feelings that were coming up around what was happening back home, right? Because they didn't know if family members and friends were alive, and it was just a really tumultuous time for L and other people in his community. So they formed a support group, and he says, even from the emails, the fact that we realized that we existed, like we weren't alone, and suddenly getting an email like, oh, I'm wanting to participate in this, I want to be a part of this support group. For me, it was really important because I was like, okay, I'm not alone. By the way, I have doctored up the text a little bit. I've taken out some of the ums and that kind of thing. For for discourse analysis or something, you might not want to do that, but for this, I think it's appropriate. D says, and D was involved in essentially an anti-racist organizational group that did story circle methodologies, which is very interesting. He says, it would often feel this way in the story circles, that some bigger meta image was being created. And I think at times it was like a sense of it as a mosaic. And at other times, maybe it was more integrated than that. It felt like something woven. It felt really palpable, because at the end of that experience, everybody gets an image. Everybody shares stories, and they're all on the same theme. And around that experience, I don't know, a little bit dissolves. That sense of isolation in the work you're doing, of course, but also in the sense of like, my story isn't mine, it's something that's shared. And I think that can be really profound for people in a healing way. So I really like this image of sort of, rather than these sort of individual disconnected stories, this methodology, this type of group work, for D seemed to be encouraging a kind of shared storytelling, which he seemed to think was really powerful, and I think is really powerful. Okay, so that's the first one. Second one is sort of exploring common experiences and struggles. This is something that I anticipated to find based on my own experiences in group work. For example, D says, one thing that's happening is that they're starting to see that okay, so a little background here. D's anti-racist organization was for teachers. And I've anonymized where it is and what it is. I think I maybe say it's in Houston. So it's an anti-racist organization for teachers, and a lot of white people, white teachers working with minority students. So that's the background here. He says, one thing that's happening is that they're starting to see that the particular struggles that they have in their own classroom are actually not just limited to their own classroom. That the person next to them is having the same experience with their administration, sort of pushing them to be more punitive with their students, for example. And then you can see the light bulbs kind of lighting up and something happening there in the capacity to kind of consider the patterns. Right? So I find this really interesting because, and I've had this experience personally, where sometimes when you're doing group work, you start to look around and notice that maybe what you thought of as something that was unique to you in terms of something you're struggling with, a symptom, a problem that you have, it's really not just you, sort of returning to the shared story element. I've had that experience many times, and so did some of my participants. So L says, and L is a therapist, just as background here. The discourses that are being used at the hospital are like, this is a mental illness, it's in your body. You need to take these pills, and then you need to learn these skills, and then you can go out and be functional. But there's like never this link between their symptoms and the outside world. He says later on, in the support group that he was in, instead of anger turning inward, we were able to put the anger outside into the external factors and more of the social, political, economic factors that were affecting our conditions and our people. We were able to kind of identify, so we're angry, but what are we angry about, right? Like at the beginning, we were feeling just angry, and then we were like, okay, I'm angry because of this and this and this and that. We were able to identify the political reason why we're angry. Right. So in my experience in group work and in my participants' experience in group work, it's not uncommon for people for there to be a kind of consciousness raising element to it, where people begin to sort of connect the dots and say, okay, there's something going on not just in my own head. There's something going on that's creating a sort of common struggle for a lot of us. 3, there was an element of political education that happened for some of my participants. So Jay says, I was in Atlanta, that's anonymous, in 2000 something for Black Lives Matter. There's so much that I've had to talk to this group about, and I feel like if anything may have helped them a little bit, because they're people who may not have had that kind of experience. I've spent a lot of time on the street. She says, open their minds politically about the horrors of the police state. So Jay was in the peer-led, peer-oriented support group, but it actually came up for her and for people in the group, some of her political experiences, and she felt like that was helpful for the people in the group who had not quite had as much experience kind of on the streets dealing with these issues. So she was able to share some of that information and wisdom with them. D says, it was a group for folks who were teachers in Houston, transplant teachers, and who are mostly white. And they're trying to work on whether it's possible for them to actually be in solidarity with the communities that they supposedly are helping. Right? So in this anti-racist organization, there's a big emphasis on allyship. But not just allyship, but effective allyship. Right? So he talks more about that later. So another one is crossing group boundaries and forming connections. If you know anything about sort of conventional group therapy, this is not always the case, but sometimes there's kind of boundaries around, like, we're in the group, but we don't really talk to each other outside the group, that kind of thing, right? So for a lot of my participants, that was not the case. So Jay says, I have sort of formed friendships out of this group. Like there's that same person who talked me off that ledge briefly. They were having a kind of mental health crisis and they were going to go into a hospital, but they reached out to one of the group members and were supported by that group member. We've actually had Zooms. They live in different places, and watched movies and shows together. And I'm like, it's hard, be friends with someone when they're in San Diego and I'm in Boston, anonymized. She says, it's hard to form a group or join a group and you don't really know anyone. So even having one connection makes it a lot easier because he knows all these other people, So it's been easier since then, right? So there's this element of it's not just inside the group the group, I think all of the groups for my participants that I've looked at so far have been fairly porous, right? So it hasn't been sort of this traditional understanding of group therapy where they come together, they do work in a group, and then they leave and they live their own separate lives. There's a lot of porousness that my participants described. So L says, by the first or second session, people started to share their phone numbers. We would see each other a lot after that. We started hanging out together after that. They would have fun together, they would check in on each other often. And so there was a lot of care and love right from the beginning. He said, and remember this is the context of his home country was experiencing a natural disaster, so it's a unique context, and I'm going to be pointing that out in my dissertation. He says, like, how did this even happen, right? Because in just a couple weeks, like literally 3 weeks ago, we went from being completely isolated, not knowing each other, being depressed, having survivor's guilt, being hopeless, to being connected, to creating a community, creating new friends. Right? So again, this sort of porousness where actual sort of real life friendships, relationships, community was created. Okay. So I think one of the themes, there's more on this page than the others, you can see, and I'm still looking through the data, working through the data. This is not at all complete. These are just some preliminary findings. But one of the most compelling aspects of this that I've seen so far, to me, has to do with what I'm calling for the moment, going from healing to action, community and agency and empowerment. So L says, in the beginning we were feeling a little hopeless. We were feeling isolated. Now we're feeling angry. We're feeling motivated. By session 3, we started kind of more processing what to do with that anger, right? So at first it was like, we're noticing the anger, noticing the motivation, and then finally, session 3, we were like, okay, let's talk a little bit more about our emotions and how we're feeling, but what are we going to do after? He goes on to say, generating energy and motivation, doing things that a lot of us have never done before. So just a little more background here. The support group that Elle was involved in actually turned into a sort of activist group, which is really interesting, sort of trying to create visibility, advocate for the people back in his home country. So that's the context there. So generating energy and motivation, doing things that a lot of us have never done before, like organizing, talking to representatives, getting a meeting with the CEO, talking to newspapers. Right? So there was this movement from support group to activist group, trying to represent and advocate for and really support and aid his community and his country back home. So he says, even when you're sharing responsibilities, what is this person good at? This is a little bit about strategy, and it makes me think of, you know, Hooks's Home Places a little bit. Even when you're sharing responsibilities, what is this person good at? What is this other person good at? Even having that process of understanding everyone's personality and their needs. What are our goals? What do we need? How are we going to achieve it? What people are going to do what in this scenario? So there was strategizing that went on, sort of, you know, emerging from the support group. And he does say, I think there needs to be a healing step before we act. So he believed that the sort of support group was really helpful in sort of this turn to action, political action. He believed that it was important that there was a sort of healing, sort of community-oriented support system set up before they went on to do this other work. He says, not only do I think that it helped me be less isolated, but also it helped me be a lot more effective. I think that transformed me in the sense that, one, I don't feel as though what I'm doing is pointless or useless or doesn't attune to my values, but also I felt like the sense of empowerment, the sense of mastery. Oops. Oh, I didn't mean to go. Can't go back? Okay. Well, one thing I was going to say is that L, actually said that he struggled a little bit in the interview to talk about his experience, because for him it was a pronoun issue. For him, it felt like it was a we experience that he experienced with that group, starting off with the support group and turning into the activist group. So he didn't feel like it was an I thing. He felt like it was a we thing, and I found that really significant. See if I can remember what the last one was. It won't let me go back here. I believe the last one was D. Yeah, the last one on that slide was D, talking about in the anti-racist organization. He felt proud that something happened, right? So they were doing this these story circles. They were sort of sharing experiences. They were doing some consciousness raising. But he said that what happened, what a lot of the white people in those groups realized, was that it wasn't enough to call yourself an ally. What they had to do, and what they did do, was actually go out and join historically black teachers unions, other organizations, other anti-racist organizations, and even some organizations that were predominantly white, but that could still support their black colleagues, their black teacher colleagues, whether that's through just providing support, providing money, resources, whatever. So D was really proud of that, proud of the work that emerged out of the story circle methodology, where the white teachers actually went out and sort of joined and put into play sort of the political action that they had been sort of discussing and sharing with each other. So. Okay, so that's it for the preliminary findings. There's a whole lot more, but I'm still working on it. It's in progress. So that's what I have so far. I hope that's been interesting to people. I think there's a lot of really important and interesting stuff that I've found so far. Okay, so some limitations for the study. There's a tension between my desire to study, in some sense, collectivities, and focusing on interviewing individual people. Right? So there's a methodological tension there. I think it could be really interesting to interview, to do a focus group. I think it could be really interesting to do a sort of ethnographic work on a concrete community, like some of the ones that my participants were describing. And then there's also some Liberatory-inspired actor network theory type methodological stuff, which I'm not going to get into. But I do have a question around methodologically how to sort of do justice to what I'm curious about. And I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. Of course, there's some generalizability issues here. Like I said, the person who was in the group, the support group that turned into an activist group, that was a very specific context with the natural disaster back home. I've never heard of anything like that happening before. Certainly support group work can inspire action. I mean, more than one of my participants have talked about that, but that specific thing of the support group turning into an activist group is pretty unique. So there's some generalizability issues with the small sample size and the self-selected nature of the participants. So I suspect that a lot of my participants are people who have had really positive and meaningful experiences in groups. Less so, I talk here, could also be people who've had really negative experiences. I haven't really gotten that impression from my interviews. But so there are some issues of generalizability here. What I would say about that is that, I'm not that interested in forming like an arch model. I am interested in finding patterns and themes, but I'm also okay fleshing out sort of each person's experience and each person's story. To borrow Dee's language, to create a kind of mosaic where it doesn't have to be totally integrated. So I'm okay with that. I don't know if that's allowed in qualitative work, but I'm okay with it. Okay, so strengths, I'm a little over an hour, so I'm going to go through this very quickly. Because there's so few people, I'm able to engage really deeply with the data, which I'll be doing more of. I do think it fills a gap in the existing literature, again, because so much of the literature on group work is focused on individual outcomes, and that's not my focus. Also, there have been studies that have analyzed the psychologically empowering aspects of collective political action, but none that I've seen specifically looking at the psychologically empowering aspects of group work for political action. Okay, so I haven't seen anything on that. So to conclude, so there's this phrase, decolonizing psychic space, and it comes from the philosopher Kelly Oliver, whose work I want to read more. So again, I'm really interested in sort of the creation of what I'm calling the psychological commons, kind of echoing off of Mary Watkins's work. I'm really interested in doing that because I think in some ways it can be a necessary precursor to important political work that needs to be done. And there's healing aspects to it, which are also important. So I want to understand more about that. I want to understand how you do it, what's needed to do it. I want, this is a lot of my reasoning for doing qualitative work here. Could have done just purely theoretical, but I wanted to find others who are interested in similar work. I wanted to learn from their experiences and then try to talk about their experiences and put them out there. So there's a little bit of an issue around, I'm going to be using a lot of Foucault, and if you know anything about Foucault, he has a pretty strong critique of therapeutic practices, particularly what he talks about as confessional forms of subjectivity. So if I want to use Foucault, I'm going to have to be careful here, meticulous. I do have some ideas about that. Hart and Negri talk about what they call the alter modern, which I don't have time to get into that, but I will be talking about that in my dissertation. Another problem is the intangibility of the phenomena. So, I was interviewing someone and I asked him about some sort of, experience in the group, and he said, well, that's hard to quantify or even qualify. And I said, I couldn't help it. I couldn't resist. I said, welcome to my dissertation. So, this sense of collectivity, this shared storytelling, it's not easy to quantify. It's not even easy to qualify. I'm hoping to rely quite a bit on metaphor, which I have sort of sub-questions not listed, but I've been asking my participants about metaphor, if they can think of any metaphors for their experiences, because I think that's a really good way to get at this. So that's a difficulty. Finally, there's some political sensitivity here. So some of the people that I interviewed, identify as anarchists, identify as communists. So I have to be sensitive how I talk about these things. I have to be very careful with confidentiality, because I don't want to get anyone in trouble or share any sensitive information, right? So that's just something that I'm thinking about as I move forward. So, okay, that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope it was interesting to you. You know, when I started looking at the data, I was like, wow, there's some really cool stuff here. So I'm looking forward to diving into it more. I will say, you know, if anybody has any feedback for me, whether that's encouragement or, you know, constructive criticism or whatever, feel free to reach out to me. Or if you want to collaborate. Thank you.